So you've been plotting supply and demand. Maybe you've been doing it in Excel, maybe you've been doing it in Python. In your economics course, likely you want to show shifts in supply and demand. One of the challenges with using Excel to show shifts in supply and demand is, of course, you need to have data for your demand and supply curve, and then you need to have data for the new supply or demand curve after the shift. It's a little bit easier to do in Python, but it still does require a general demand or supply curve graph, either based on data or based on a formula in order to get you started. If you do want to shift supply and demand curves in Python, then go to my GitHub site. It is drstephpowers.github.io/econ-in-python. So econ in Python. And in a previous video, we looked at how you could use Python to graph demand and supply and how you could find equilibrium. Now we're going to shift the curves. So we're going to go here to the link where it says shift curves, and it takes you into GitHub. And what you'll need to do then is open Google Colab. So there's a little icon here that doesn't always show up, but this takes this worksheet that you see here and opens it in Google Colab. If you have a Google Drive account, you can then run the code in Python on your device. So you'll want to sign in to Google Drive. You'll want to copy this to your own Google Drive so that you have it to amend as well as use later. You'll notice here this is the same worksheet that we were working in when we graphed supply and demand and found equilibrium. We're really just working on the bottom half of this worksheet. And that's because in the previous video, you found supply and demand and you found equilibrium. And so we had created this graph here based on our supply and demand curve with the black marks indicating the equilibrium price and quantity. Well, now we want to shift the demand curve or the supply curve to show how that change in demand or change in supply will change equilibrium. Perhaps you're working through a problem in your class which is more theoretical. So you're looking for simply supply increased or demand decreased, what happened to price. And so if you're doing that, you can start here with this data set with these numbers and simply look at it. Did the price go up or down, as opposed to focusing on specific quantities or prices. So in the previous video, we had a formula related to demand and one related to supply. So we had that the price demanded was equal to 126 minus 0.6 quantity demanded. The idea here is that our demand curve has a negative slope, right? So that's the negative 0.6. And the intercept of 126 would be at what price would no customers be willing and able to buy. That is, where would this orange line cross the vertical axes? So we have this formula here. PD equals 126 minus 0.6 quantity demanded. And to create our graph, we created a range of quantities from 100 to 200 in increments of 10. This allowed us to create this graph that showed the demand curve and showed our supply curve over this range of quantities. So we have our quantity demanded, we have our quantity supplied here as the quantity increases, or as the price increases, quantity increases. So we can see here's that positive slope of 0.49, and we can see that it crosses the vertical axes at about a negative 40. So we have these two formulas here to start with. We use this to create our original graph that you see here. So I'm just going to switch to a Google account where I'm logged in. Go to that same one here. Okay. So we plotted our fitted lines. We have our graph. Now, what if we want to shift the demand curve? So we want to show this graph, but we want to show that if we increase demand, what happens to equilibrium? So we want this orange graph to shift to the right, and it should show then that we get a higher price and a higher quantity sold. So there's going to be that equilibrium quantity where quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal should happen up here instead. So how do we do that? Well, if you have the formulas here from your original scenario, or if you're doing theoretical, start with these, then we need to take our quantity demanded that went from 100 to 200, so over this range in 10 increments, and we want to increase demand. So we're going to shift it to the right. So I'm going to add 50, just for visual effect here, to this quantity demanded, add 50 to the quantities, and then it's going to put those quantities into that old formula so that we can see the change. So I have my quantity demanded 2 is just the original quantity demanded plus 50 added to it. And the prices related to demand, we call PD2 here, is that same 126 minus 0.6 quantity demanded. So we'll run that. And then we can plot that information. So all we've done is added a line to our graphing code. We still have our original demand and supply. That's the first 2 lines. We still have our horizontal and vertical lines that mark the old equilibrium. We still have our legend and our labels. So the only addition here is this plt.plot that has the new quantities, where the quantity demanded increased by 50, and the new resulting prices from our formula. When we run that, what you end up with is this new green downward sloping demand curve where quantity has shifted over by 50. So notice all the quantities are over to the right by 50. And as predicted, the new equilibrium is at a higher price and a higher quantity sold. So we can show here on this graph an increase in demand causes prices to go up and quantity sold to increase. You could repeat the same process by making demand decrease. So take the quantity demanded, which went from 100 to 200 in increments of 10, and subtract 50. So we're shifting the quantities to the left. We're going to use that same price formula as that we've had before. And we'll plot our new quantities and our new prices against the original supply and demand curve. When we do that here, we now see the green curve to the left. All the quantities are to the left by 50, and you can see that our equilibrium price is now lower, and the equilibrium quantity, the quantity at which buyers and sellers are willing to sell the same amount that customers are willing to buy, is now here at a lower quantity. So a decrease in demand caused a decrease in the price and the quantity sold. So if you're looking to create a graph that illustrates the shift in demand, you can use this code here with these numbers if you're trying to create a theoretical version to represent without actually having the data to do so. What about supply? Well, supply works the same way. We can take our range of quantities from 100 to 200 in increments of 10 and simply add 50 to the quantities related to supply. So we have our original supply and demand. We're looking at quantities going from 100 to 200 in increments of 10, and we have our formulas that give us the demand curve and the supply curve. We take that and change just the supply one. Here we're shifting the supply curve to the right by 50, and we're seeing what happens. We plot our original supply, our original demand. We plot our original equilibrium using our black lines here for the horizontal and vertical axes, and we simply add in that third row there to represent the new supply curve when quantity has gone up by 50 and the resulting change in price based on our formula. So we run that, and you can see here's our supply curve shift to the right. It goes over by 50, which means that when supply increases, it's going to cause the price to fall and the quantity sold to increase. So we have a higher quantity sold because the business is willing to sell more, and now we have a larger surplus putting downward pressure on the price. So an increase in supply causes prices to fall and the quantity sold to increase. We can represent that. We can represent a shift of the supply curve to the left. That's to the right, so this shouldn't actually be plus, it should be minus. We're going to shift the supply curve to the left, make it minus 50. Same formula here. Plug it into our graph. Here we have our old equilibrium. Here we have a decrease in supply. That decrease in supply means that the equilibrium price is going to go up and the quantity sold is going to go down. If businesses are not willing to provide as much, it's going to drive up the price because of a shortage, and it means less quantity is going to be sold. So this scenario looked at shifting the supply curve to the left, less supply. This one looked at shifting it to the right, more supply. We've also looked at the increase and decrease in demand. So you can graph your demand and supply curves in Python, and then you can show those shifts simply by taking your quantity and adding or subtracting a value if you already have your demand and supply curve in formula form to show the relationship between prices and quantities.